Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about world affairs and the people who shape it. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch, and in this show we discuss topical global issues and have in-depth conversations with personalities in foreign policy. Global Dispatches is presented in partnership with Humanity in Action, an international educational organization, and I am a Humanity in Action Senior Fellow. Exactly 2 weeks to the day before this interview, Beatrice Finh received a phone call from Norway. It was the Nobel Committee informing her that the NGO she leads, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, was awarded the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. The committee cited ICAN, as the NGO is known, for its work to achieve an international treaty against nuclear weapons. The treaty is often compared to the Landmine Treaty or the Convention Against Chemical Weapons in that it invokes broadly humanitarian principles to ban what is an inherently indiscriminate weapon. The treaty was finalized in July and has already gained over 50 signatories from governments, with many more expected in the near future. And in this episode, we discuss the logic behind this treaty and its intentions. And Beatrice describes how it took a kind of fearlessness and disregard for traditional power dynamics to succeed here. And it's worth pointing out that this is a treaty that is opposed, at least for now, by all the nuclear weapons possessing states. We also discuss Beatrice's life and career and how she became interested in nuclear issues, which before a key internship seemed distant and relevant more in academia than in the real world. It is a great conversation, and we start off with a discussion about the moment she learned her organization had won the Nobel Peace Prize. If you are new to the podcast, welcome. Please visit globaldispatchespodcast.com to check out our very robust archives of conversations like the one you are about to hear that tells both personal stories and also issues of substance in international affairs. If you are a regular listener, thank you for being a regular listener. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime if you have suggestions of people I should interview, topics I should cover, or anything else that's on your mind. You can use the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com or hit me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg. And now here is my conversation with Beatrice Finh.
And just 2 days before, there's been a news report speculated that we were one of the contenders. Not the favorite, but one of them. So there had been some sort of excitement in the campaign about this. I don't think anyone realistically thought that we would win, but it was just exciting to be mentioned in the kind of running. But of course, 11:15, 10:11 was like, yeah, no, it's not going to happen. And that's okay. You always get a little bit disappointed though, like you lost somehow.
Yeah.
You do something wrong. No. But and then the phone rang and it was for me. And he had this very strong Norwegian accent. And I immediately just like, oh my God, no, it's a Norwegian journalist. It's just and then he introduced himself from the Nobel Committee. And I just had to like sort of grab my colleague because she was watching the live webcast from, she's Norwegian. So she was following the Norwegian kind of pre-talk on TV. I was like waving to her. I said, turn the volume down. This is important. And she's like, yeah, whatever. And I felt like that sentence that he said, the presenting himself and that he's calling with some good news, or at least I hope it's good news, he said. And I was just, it took forever. And I get to the point. Like, is this real, or are you calling me to ask for someone else's number or something?
Oh my gosh, he was like giving a preamble in his Norwegian accent from the committee before. That's really funny.
So I really, really wanted him to can you just say it if it's real or not? And then, he gave us it's actually recorded and they posted it on Twitter.
Oh, really? They record the conversation?
Yeah. I mean,
so they're stringing you along before they actually say, congratulations, you've received the Nobel Peace Prize.
And I feel like you can sort of I feel like you can almost hear my excitement with every word he's saying, like, oh my God, I think this is it. I think this is, oh my God, this is unbelievable. And then I'm just saying, wow, a lot of times. Not a very eloquent response.
I think that's about the perfect amount of elocution you can expect in that kind of situation.
Yeah, and then he's like, and then I'm saying something like, oh, I'm just really shocked. And yeah, so that was it.
That's amazing. So who was your first phone call? Like, what was your first conversation after that?
Well, they immediately put me on hold then because he had to go to the live. I'm like, okay, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. What am I supposed to do? And then they put me over to Stockholm for just a quick word with the staff team there that runs the Nobel website. Mm-hmm. And they wanted like a mini interview. I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say. Like, I'm still haven't really. And at the same time, my two colleagues are just staring at me. Like, is this real? Like, trying to mouth to me, like, is it for real? Is it really real? And then my colleague said, it's not a prank, right? So then I, of course, panicked and thought that maybe this is a really evil prank from someone.
You know, I keep hearing from people who tell these stories that their first instinct is that it's a prank from a friend.
Yeah, but I feel like, that would be like the meanest thing ever. So
it's an elaborate ruse at this point, if it is a ruse, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So if anyone is thinking about doing that, don't. It would be so mean. No, and then I hung up. And the thing is, like, my friend is then filming this, so he has it on film. This is not. We haven't published this because I'm just like walking around, leaning towards the wall and like trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do. And you can see that I'm grabbing my phone, and people are like, "Oh, did you? Who are you texting?" I'm like, I'm not texting anyone. I'm turning my notifications off.
You just want to enjoy this moment.
I had a feeling that this was going to blow up my phone.
Yes.
No, I texted my husband then afterwards, and then we watched the actual announcement at the same time, before we did anything else, because we wanted to make sure that it was really real.
Yeah.
And then
you still had doubts at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh my gosh.
Absolutely. And then we actually took a few minutes. Like, the phone started ringing, of course, immediately. Mm-hmm. But we decided to just try to watch them read out the whole justification, and just before we start, panically answering the phone and try to figure out what to do next. We took like 5 minutes just to stand there.
And how? I mean, so how did that initial moment? So you took a few moments, but then at some point you have to turn your notifications on. You have to answer your phone. How do you deal with the sudden onslaught of attention? I mean, both to you personally and also to your work.
I mean, it was extremely intensive. And, we're a big campaign in terms of our partner organizations spread out all over the world. But the headquarters in Geneva, we're 3.5 staff people. So we don't have a media team and it's not like you've made a plan for this. I mean, when there were speculations that you just entertain it in your mind for a few seconds and then, it's never going to happen. Mm-hmm. So luckily our office is located in a big office building that's owned by the World Council of Churches, which is a big collection of all churches around the world. And they have a whole communications department. And 5 minutes after, they came running up to our office. Do you need help? And I'm like, yes.
Oh, that's amazing. The World Council, and they're a great humanitarian organization.
Absolutely. And they are members of ICAN as well. They're a partner organization of ICAN. So we work with them closely, of course.
Yeah, it was one of your partners that put us in touch, I should say. I think it was the Arms Control Association. People I've interviewed before on the podcast suggested that I reach out to you.
So I think it was really, they helped us set up the press conference. But of course, I know some of the journalists in Geneva from the correspondents, Reuters and AP and those. So they were all, of course, on their way up to the office. Some of them tried to escape from the security. They tried to stop them in the entrance, of course, but some of them snuck around and found our office and knocked on the door, of course, of our tiny little office that we share. And there's actually some funny photos because my colleague Daniel, he puts up all these funny pictures on our walls. So I'm doing this whole live interview with Reuters and AP, and obviously they must have seen it. I didn't see it because I was just talking to the cameras. But behind me, there's this printed picture of a Lego man that says everything is awesome on top of it.
Yes.
So there's all these photos of me standing with this little Lego everything is awesome next to me.
Well, that's great. I mean, and it's a good visual metaphor of the day, I have to imagine.
I think so. There could have been worse things on that wall, I think.
We're speaking about 2 weeks to the day, right after the call. Mm-hmm. And I know last week you were in New York for giving your press conference at the UN, but I mean, I have to imagine one of the significant sort of political outcomes of the Nobel Prize Committee conferring the prize to your organization is obviously the heightened attention that it gives to the nuclear ban treaty. So can you for our audience, give us the rundown of what that treaty is, and how you got to the point in July this year that it was signed by so many countries? What does the treaty say?
Well, the treaty is a comprehensive prohibition of nuclear weapons, which have not existed yet. We've had treaties that say that some states can't develop nuclear weapons, but nothing that really prohibits the use and possession and development in the same way as other weapons, like biological weapons, chemical weapons have been prohibited. Mm-hmm. So we identified that a few years ago, that that's a significant weakness in the legal framework on how international law regulates in weapons that are inhumane and targeted towards civilians.
Yeah.
That
nuclear
weapons
the inherently indiscriminate weapons.
Exactly. I mean, we have prohibited chemical and biological weapons, landmines, cluster munitions, because of their indiscriminate impact on civilians. But somehow nuclear weapons are okay. So, and it's because we've, as an international community, given all of these exceptions to nuclear weapons, like they somehow don't follow normal rules. So the treaty tries to change that we treat nuclear weapons like a weapon, not as a power tool or a magic security kind of building thing. It's a weapon. So let's treat it like a weapon. And what do we do with weapons that cause these kind of consequences? We prohibit them. And that's how you get to elimination, rather than trying to eliminate them first and then prohibit them.
Because, you know, it's worth pointing out that, like, the guiding principle on sort of nuclear disarmament and elimination has always been like the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, right?
Well, it's been sort of trying to get rid of something that you value very much at the same time. So how they've tried to, I mean, most states have agreed that nuclear weapons are bad and they should be eliminated at some point, very far in the future. But in order to get there, we need to take all these steps that at the same time we keep saying that we need nuclear weapons for our defense. We need them to be secure. Without nuclear weapons, we will be totally insecure. How are you supposed to give up a weapon that you treat like that? Why would you give up a weapon that you treat like that?
And so what you're trying to do then is change sort of the politics of nuclear weapons.
We're trying to make a sort of draw a line and say, from now on, these people think nuclear weapons are unacceptable, and we're going to keep growing that number, or these countries.
So to try to put them in that same kind of category as cluster munitions or chemical weapons.
And make them a little bit more unattractive for countries to have and to develop in the future or to maintain. Make it more politically costly to keep having nuclear weapons. Right now, it's a lot of benefits in a way with having nuclear weapons. And if we're really serious about nuclear disarmament, we have to make it also a bit unattractive and difficult for countries to have nuclear weapons. So that this is sort of a part of this kind of building a pressure on the states and kind of rejecting this and making it less interesting for them, because we don't see any countries bragging about their amazing biological weapons or chemical weapons, or even landmines or cluster munitions these days, because they have been prohibited by treaty. So even if not all states are part of the treaty, they are still seen as bad weapons, something that countries with a humanitarian record don't really want to be associated with.
Do you see your movement as sort of picking up where that nuclear freeze movement of the 1980s left off? I mean, that people forget, but that was like a really massive social movement, but then sort of fizzled at the end of the Cold War.
I think so. I think we're trying to re-energize people, to mobilize them on this issue. I don't think we're going to see a similar engagement as the nuclear freeze movement. I don't think that that's how people, things have changed. People's activism and sort of campaigning has changed since then. Today, for example, there's much more organized NGOs, civil society organizations that do a lot of kind of full-time activism instead of having a broader mass of people spending a few hours a week on it. So I think it just looks a little bit different. But yes, definitely, we're trying to engage a new generation, the people that grew up after the Cold War, that don't remember the Cold War and have no kind of feeling that nuclear war was a threat or a possibility. Because we kind of, since the end of the Cold War,
it's suddenly becoming a little more real, I must say.
Yeah, and I think that this is like an extremely depressing situation, but also full of opportunities. And I think that we're seeing two parallel trends. You have the increased hostility between the United States and North Korea, but also the other nuclear armed states are all modernizing, upgrading their weapons, strengthening the sort of position of nuclear weapons in their security policies. And then you have the majority states of the world that actually move into a legally binding treaty that prohibits and tries to stigmatize these weapons, and they are happening at the same time.
And so what happened on July 7th, 2017 this year? Can you walk me through that day, that moment?
Yeah, so that was the last day of the negotiations process. So governments had set up 4 weeks of negotiations, with 1 week in March and 3 weeks in July, and June, July. And that's when we had the final text of the treaty that had been negotiated over those weeks, and it was put up for adoption. And one government demanded a vote in the Netherlands, but everyone else in the negotiations voted yes. So 122 countries, I think, voted yes on that day. And that meant that the treaty was finalized. It was adopted.
And now it's sort of it requires ratification in order to enter into force, presumably. Like a certain number of states need to ratify it.
So now on the 20th of September, it opened for signature, which is sort of the first step to join a treaty. So that leaves countries a few months to sort of send it back to capital, do the legal reviews and stuff. And then once they've signed it, on 20th of September, it opened. That was on the first day, I think 50 countries signed it. Mm-hmm. And now states can keep signing it forever, but they also have to ratify it in order to make it legally binding on themselves. And that means that they have to go through their national law and make sure that their national law is in line with this treaty. And that will require parliamentary approval and debate and draft legislation.
Whatever the ratification process is.
Exactly. So in some countries it's fast. In some countries, it's very slow. And
in the U.S., it's a never, because we don't ratify international treaties anymore. It requires 2/3 of the Senate, and they can't even get half the Senate to do anything. But
which sad.
Yeah, well, on any treaty, even like the disabilities treaty, which is not politically controversial, you can't get that one passed. Anyway, so no nuclear possessing state signed this treaty. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And did any NATO member, you said that Netherlands participated in the negotiations, but they did not end up signing it. Did any NATO member sign it?
Not yet.
Do you have any expectation that at least a non-nuclear NATO state might sign it?
I think so. And I think it might take a while. I mean, they have been put under enormous amount of pressure from the nuclear armed states, from especially the nuclear armed NATO states, so UK, France, and the United States, who are clearly saying in internal documents that we have seen that have been leaked that we are very concerned about the stigmatization of nuclear weapons. They are kind of admitting that this treaty, without them participating, will still have an impact and will change the way their weapons are seen, and they don't like it, so they need to stop it. So they are fighting very hard to keep states outside this process. But I think that there's this huge popular support for nuclear disarmament and a treaty banning nuclear weapons in many NATO states in Europe, for example. There's a lot of politicians that are interested in this. The whole initiative was started by a Norwegian Labour government, which then pulled out when it was a right-wing government in place for a while. So I think that there's definitely things can happen, it can change. But also, this puts these NATO states in very difficult positions. Are you going to work for nuclear disarmament? Or are you going to align yourself with Trump right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and well,
I mean, it's just.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's as you said earlier. Nuclear weapons had, not until this new campaign really been considered more than like a tool to guarantee security, right? As opposed to an actual weapon that could be used in war that's inherently indiscriminate and has terrible humanitarian consequences in it. And it just seems that there could be this disconnect that I'm sure you've identified in your work between popular opinion and sort of what foreign policy elites in these countries are doing.
Absolutely. I think that's also what we're trying to do. We're trying to make this an issue for people to influence their governments on, because for a very long time it has been an elite issue, and there's like 1,000 of acronyms. It's all very complicated, and all governments will say, oh yes, nuclear disarmament, very important, but then have like 100 of initiatives that don't really mean much, that they can sort of put like smoke screens that, oh well, we're working on verification possibilities here, and we're doing this kind of non-proliferation work there, and we're thinking about North Korea there, but not addressing the fact that there are countries like Norway, for example, that are part of NATO, that are part of these plans to indiscriminately slaughter hundreds of thousands of civilians, wipe out entire cities. I think that's not how we see nuclear weapons, and I think that's how we have to start seeing them. And that's the camp trying to make that an issue that people are aware of, that the German people know that we are participating in exercises right now this week that involves nuclear weapons. What are they targeting? What are they practicing for? Are they practicing on how to wipe out an entire city full of civilians? Which cities? And this is something so I think that's something that we need to sort of, so that people can engage and impact the political elites in this.
If the treaty is to be sort of widely successful, that it accomplishes all the goals that you want it to accomplish, what's like the likely political sort of steps towards that direction? I mean, just thinking out loud to myself, it seems, first you would get all of Europe on board because they tend to be a little more progressive on these issues. Then you have to kind of, work more broadly to raise consciousness here in the United States, to get them on board. Even though, we're talking like, it could be 50 years down the road, it's still sort of a process that takes a long time, I would imagine.
Well, I think it's also important to not get too locked into the treaty. I mean, obviously the treaty is what we're working on right now, but it's not the end goal. The end goal is getting rid of nuclear weapons. And like you said, I mean, the United States doesn't ratify treaties, so maybe we don't need the United States to ever sign or ratify it, or maybe if that is not the best way to get change in the US. We could, for example, with the cluster munitions treaty, that the United States did not participate in negotiations. It didn't sign on to the treaty. But just a few years after the treaty entered into force, the last American company that produced cluster munitions announced last year that it will stop. So there are no more American producers of cluster munitions because of the growing international stigma, the reduction of market for this weapon. It's a bad, like lots of banks are divesting from companies that produce weapons that are prohibited by treaties. So I think it's like you can see an immediate impact on these kind of things. The Landmine Treaty, for example, yes, it's 20 years now, but now the US has aligned its policy with the Landmine Treaty. It won't sign it, probably out of principle. But maybe we can't ever expect the United States to sign these international agreements, but they still change their behavior. And I think that's the key point. So, and I think that doesn't have to take 50 years. That can take much less time.
Are you working on your speech?
Well, going to start soon, I think.
Okay.
It's yeah.
And you'll be the one accepting the award on behalf of ICAN?
Yeah, me and someone else, which I'm not allowed to confirm yet.
Okay.
But maybe two.
Oh, good. Well, it's interesting. I love reading Nobel Prize acceptance speeches. One of my favorites is from William Faulkner in 1950, I think, who accepted the literature award. He's a writer, and he wrote, and his acceptance speech was short, and it was all about sort of how to be a writer in this nuclear age where everything can end in a minute, where you're consumed by sort of a fear of the bomb. and how that it informs every aspect of your life, and how you can, and how literature can sort of summon humanity's better angels in these dangerous times. And I've always been so moved by, I'll send you, it's always been so moved by that speech. But these questions of like sort of nuclear annihilation tend to bring out the best speeches, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, I mean, for us, I think it's also, this is obviously about nuclear weapons, but it's also about civil society. And I think we're in a very strange time in the world right now, where it feels like things are getting worse. They might not actually get worse. We just might hear more about bad things than we did before. And I've been thinking a lot about democracy and how we, this kind of idea that we show up every fourth year and vote, and that's it. That's democracy, where it's the kind of the way NGOs works is so not being satisfied with that as a democracy. It's not about who we vote. It's about everything we do in between elections as well, and how NGOs can change the context in which these politicians who win the election operate. We don't have to just accept what they do and wait for the next one. We can actually change things already today. So I think it's going to be interesting to also reflect a bit on NGOs and civil society at a time where I think the world really needs that kind of engagement.
So I would love to learn more about you and how you got involved in this line of work. So are you Swedish? Is that where you're from?
Yeah.
Where were you born in Sweden?
In Gothenburg on the west coast.
And I mean, growing up, were your family, were your parents involved in these kinds of activist issues?
They've always been very politically engaged. I remember, for example, I mean, not particularly about nuclear weapons, but I do remember that there was a period in the 90s where we don't drink French wine or eat French cheese because of the tests that France did, early 90s.
Yeah. The French nuclear tests, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was this like boycott movement over Europe that, there was like a lot of protests around that. So they've always been very politically active. But then I got into this issue when I was at university and studied international relations.
Where did you go to school?
Stockholm University. And I got an internship with a feminist peace organization. But I wasn't really interested in nuclear weapons at all. I thought it was a pretty weird issue, irrelevant.
And what years? What about was this? Like what years?
2005, 2006, I think it was. I wanted to work on human rights and environment. The real stuff that are really kind of urgent and important. Nuclear weapons felt very old-fashioned and outdated. Like, do they even exist anymore?
That's interesting. Even for someone who is as aware as you, an IR student, that the sort of nuclear weapons weren't like the sexy issue back then.
No, because it was just sort of. I mean, I remember reading about realism and there was some nuclear deterrence kind of theory at the lecture, but it never felt real. Nuclear weapons never felt real. It was just about academic debates on deterrence. So it wasn't, and it was very, very connected to the IR theories rather than the actual practical things that happen on the ground in terms of human rights violation or, climate change that were happening all over. So I think it was just it wasn't that interesting. It felt like a theory to me. But then I got involved with this organization. I got to go to their office in Geneva and do an internship. And they started sending me to this conference on disarmament, which is based in Geneva, where all of these countries get together. You have all the nuclear armed states in the same room, plus a few others. And they're supposed to negotiate disarmament. But obviously they don't. It has been deadlocked in a debate over an agenda for the last 20
Yeah, for like 30 years. Yeah, exactly. This is like one part of the UN system where like things go to die.
Yeah. It's awful. And but then of course I thought it was really cool because I'd never seen anything like that. And just to sit there and like, Russia and the US are talking about their nuclear weapons. But at the same time realizing that this is kind of bizarre. You're sitting, you're talking about these kind of crazy weapons. And you sit here and it's sort of bureaucratic and it all feels very, again, very stale and academic and theoretical rather than
But it probably is worth pointing that, even though that is an entity, the Conference on Disarmament, where nothing really happens, it does serve a political use, which is that it's sort of one of the legs on the stool of the sort of non-proliferation movement as well, and the non-proliferation treaty, which is like disarmament. Yeah, except they don't do anything. It sort of serves as the fig leaf for disarmament, so that we can focus on the more politically relevant things like non-proliferation.
Yeah, so it's sort of like that. They sort of, and kind of, I feel like a lot of, if you've read Nobel Peace speeches, maybe you've read some of Alva Myrdal, who wrote very good stuff about how the nuclear armed states, all they're doing is stalling, in a way. And that's how the NPT, for example, every 5 years, they either agree or don't agree, but they don't do anything. But they kind of just make it out like the next time, oh, now we have to come up with another agreement. Instead of doing what we already agreed to do. Like, there's never any doing, just formulating new language in UN documents that sort of say the same thing. And because diplomats rotate so much, no one stays for more than 1 or 2, so it's hard. Everyone thinks that this time we're going to do something new, but it's not. It just goes around, and then 5 years we're back at the same place.
And so how? I mean, you saw that process up close as an intern.
Yeah,
but nonetheless, that got you first interested in nuclear issues.
Yeah, so I got fascinated. I mean, it's a really fascinating issue, and also this kind of hypocrisy around nuclear weapons. How they can sit there, the nuclear armed states, and be so concerned about Iran that doesn't have nuclear weapons, while they have thousands of them, like on high alert, ready to be launched. And you can see that also in the United States now, how the U.S. is freaking out about the fact that North Korea could reach U.S. with a nuclear missile. But what about all the countries that the U.S. can reach with their nuclear missiles, which is everyone? Yeah. I mean, it's just like, that's not, it's like people in nuclear armed states don't understand how scary their nuclear weapons are to others.
Well, I mean, in a way, though, I mean, the U.S. nuclear arsenal is not scary to like Argentina, because we're not threatening Argentina, and there's no sort of hostile, intent or rhetoric. So I can understand.
No, of course not. And that's also one of the things with nuclear weapons is it's quite fascinating also how, I mean, you become a target as well, of course, when you have nuclear weapons. Who is the Russian nuclear weapons, deterring or aiming at or something like that in the United States, of course.
Me, currently right now. Yeah.
No, so I think it's like you also become a target, and it also feels people feel safe having nuclear weapons, but you've bombed your own people with your nuclear weapons. You've tested it on people in Nevada, and people are dying because of it, or have diseases, or suffer from consequences. They're not been made safe because of American nuclear weapons. They've suffered because of them.
So how did this internship, where did you go after that? How did that sort of change your career trajectory?
Well, I just got really fascinated with the sort of diplomatic world and the nuclear weapons issue. And I went back to university and I did a law degree, but kept in touch with these colleagues that I met. So I came back in 2010 and started working for that organization. It's the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, their Reaching Critical Will program. That is they try to monitor and report from what's going on in these forums.
Like the disarmament forums, like including like the cluster munitions and all that as well.
Yeah, and also like the UN General Assembly when they talk about weapons, and the conventional weapon stuff, the biological weapons meetings, and the NPT meetings. So like a wider range, arms trade treaty meetings, a wider range of weapons issues. And they were a board member of ICAN. This organization. So I was representing that organization on ICAN's board from 2011, 12, maybe 11, 12.
Well, and what sort of what issues were you personally engaging with at that time as part of the international? What's it called? The international. I've heard of it. It's a really old, and it's been around forever, right? The international women's.
So they just turned 100 years 2 years ago. So Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So I covered a lot of the nuclear weapon stuff. So I did the work in Geneva, some conventional weapons, fully autonomous weapons, which was the latest issue we started working on.
What are fully autonomous? What, killer robots? That idea?
Yeah.
Those are becoming more and more prominent. I saw recently that there was some UN movement towards that end, right?
Exactly, the campaign to stop killer robots. It's a lot of our colleagues that are part of ICAN that are also part of that campaign.
What is that campaign like? How did that one start?
Well, that started with some of these organizations. Human Rights Watch, for example, was on board and worked on that, and it's. Basically to kind of try to preemptively prohibit these weapons before they become a reality. The fact that you can't have a robot, an algorithm deciding who to kill or not.
Mm-hmm.
And where does our sort of line go in legal terms, ethical terms, moral terms?
And I mean, this is not just something we should say that's like out of the Terminator series. This is this is present in the here and now. I remember in grad school, another student was doing his research paper on this was even 5-6 years ago on killer robots and all the accidents that have attended these killer robots. Just like these robots just like shooting up people, like mistaking targets.
I mean, exactly. And how do you program them? What kind of algorithms? Do you shoot for men of a certain age with dark skin and brown hair? Is that? I mean, do you use it in policing, sort of internal affairs?
Mm-hmm. And so the idea behind this campaign is to just prevent the further development of these things.
Yeah, they're not actually. I mean, obviously, there's lines of. For you have drones that are automated, but there's still a person controlling it on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that there would be weapons that are that can adapt but have no kind of meaningful human control over them, that doesn't exist in operations yet.
And so that was the bulk of your work at that NGO.
Yeah, but still mainly nuclear weapons as well.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, one thing that I was struck, I think I was reading comments that you or your colleague wrote about how the kind of conversation in the NGO world about nuclear weapons for many years has been focused on some of what you're just talking about, like kind of inside baseball. The NGOs are talking to diplomats exclusively and not the general public. At what point did you recognize that there was this profound gap between public perceptions of nuclear weapons and sort of the work of the NGO community?
I think it's always kind of been there, especially when you talk to friends or people. They don't care about what happened at the 2010 NPT review conference. I mean, that doesn't exist.
I'm not much of a nerd, but I hear you. Yeah.
No, but sort of like, and that's not how, the commitment that governments have done under Article 6 in the NPT doesn't seem to impact the policy making at all in those countries. They do whatever they want, and they say it's in line with the NPT, whereas the rest of the world is sort of like, well, that's not how we see the NPT. But there was like no sort of feeling, we already said that some countries can have these weapons and they're going to have them forever. So I think it's really, and also being around all of these experts. And I don't know how many group of eminent people who are, always putting together a Canberra Commission or a Blix Commission or this commission. And experts' advice aren't going to save us from this issue. This is really tough decisions for politicians to make. And the example is Obama, who I think really wanted to do something, but just couldn't in the end because there was just too much resistance internally from actually doing something. So taking these very hard decisions is never going to be enough with expert advice, with recommendations from a panel. It has to be status quo, has to be unsustainable for the politicians. It has to be worse to do nothing than to move forward for politicians.
I mean, how concerned are you that it will take a catastrophe, a calamity, whether a nuclear accident or in the case of what's happening now with North Korea, an actual sort of use of a nuclear weapon for people, for individuals to sort of understand the immense destructive power of these things in a real and visual and visceral way to change that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a friend who's a diplomat who usually say that, nuclear weapons, before the ban treaty, he said, nuclear weapons will be banned, But the question is, do we do it before or after they've gone off? Mm-hmm. We have a choice in that. And I think that, yes, of course, it is difficult for people to imagine nuclear weapons. And we know, for example, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it's a very long time ago, and people easily get distracted into talking, was it right or not? Did we save lives by doing that or not? And that's not the point. That's irrelevant in a way. The fact is that this is what nuclear weapons do to people, and this is what they would do today. And what we have today is so much more than that.
And I have to imagine, I mean, on that, like part of your campaign must be engaging with survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yes. So they've been very integral part, and also survivors from nuclear testing who have shared experience and facts and information about the very long-term impact on communities, on next generations who have also get difficulties and problems. So it's, very important part.
So when you joined ICAN, were you brought on board specifically to manage the nuclear ban treaty?
Yeah, so I joined. I mean, so I was on the board of ICAN before, so quite involved, and took. There was no director in the office in Geneva. More just people with different coordinating role for different topics. So we moved to a system where we had one director who led the staff team and an expanded staff team and took control over that. So I thought it would be fun. It was just as we geared up towards getting negotiations off the ground. So it's a really exciting moment.
At what point did you realize that this treaty was actually going to be something that would be signed, that it was going to be a success?
That's hard. I know that when I understood the power of the ban treaty as an idea, because I was also a bit skeptical in the beginning. Because the more experience you have of arms control and non-proliferation, the harder it is to understand this treaty. Because this is not arms control. This is much more like Geneva Conventions than the NPT. So you have to have a different mindset in a way when you think about nuclear weapons in this treaty. But when I really understood it was at the first humanitarian conference, because this process has been preceded by 3 separate conferences on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. And the first one was in Oslo in 2013. And we had then the Norwegian State Secretary at this conference, because we organized like a civil society meeting before with like 500-600 people. And the P5 had just announced that they would boycott this meeting. And we were really nervous internally in ICAN. This was the first time they've ever boycotted something like this. But it was also the first time that someone ever dared to do something that the P5 didn't like. It just didn't happen before that.
Because the assumption is that if the P5, the veto-wielding members of the Security Council are not on board with something, there's no point in even going through the motions. Yeah.
So we were a bit nervous on how people are going to react. We decided internally that no, it's we don't need them. Like, this is an expert meeting. If they don't want to be there, then fine. But we're going to go ahead with this meeting. And we had the state secretary, Gry Larsen, and she's like a very young, cool Norwegian politician. So we had 600 people in this audience. And she said that she'd been démarched. They came to visit us at the Foreign Ministry, the P5, and they gave their arguments. And she kind of shrugged her shoulders and like, well, what can I say? They weren't so convincing, I think. And the whole audience laughed. And this was the first time we laughed at the P5. And it just clicked to me, sort of also the power of like how power is a thought, and we have conceded power to some states in our minds as well. And we can take that back. And it's quite interesting. I mean, we're not a huge organization. We have a tiny little budget. We're just a bunch of 30-year-olds, doing stuff, emailing people, meeting with politicians, just making it up as we go. And the most powerful countries in the world, the richest, the most military strong countries are trying to stop it, and they can't. And it's interesting, I think, in just terms of power dynamics. I don't know. Have you watched The Hunger Games?
No, but I intend to. I know. It's on.
It's a scene there when she has these berries, and this evil dictator says that, you're challenging the whole country, and she said, well, it has to be very fragile if a couple of berries can take it down. And I feel a little bit like that, like this kind of, they keep saying that we're threatening the entire world peace or world stability and the way that the system has been structured, and it just sort of exposes also how fragile that kind of pretend power is.
Yeah, well, and it's power. I mean, it seems that you've come to this realization that power is a state of mind in a way, right?
Mm-hmm. And you see that we talked a lot about it in ICAN, about other, perhaps not always just nuclear weapon stuff, but also our other movements and processes where a small group have claimed all the power. And it's everything from like labor, unionized movements, to women's right to vote, to getting rid of apartheid, the civil rights movement, where you have a group of power, but with all the power, and they will never give that up voluntarily. So you have to force it in a way.
But in a sense, I guess what you're doing by comparing your movement to those is identifying that the source of your power is the kind of moral righteousness of your cause.
Yeah, and justice and equality in a way, that all states are equal, and this kind of the ability to have this threat over the world and thereby dominate with your view that you are more important than everyone else is not fair.
That must be such a liberating mindset to have, I must say.
Yeah, the thing is, like, some people are like, oh, well, you're never going to succeed. And I think we've succeeded pretty well so far, so I'm pretty happy with this. If it ends here, we still think we've done a good job. But also, I don't know, it's just also so personally more satisfied to be on the side where you want to do something. We don't know how things will go, but at least we know we tried really hard, and we did really try to do something better.
And it started, and you have, and Beatrice, this is amazing. Thank you so much for your time, and congratulations again. This is after speaking to you now, I am more convinced than ever that the Nobel Commission was inspired by their choice.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Beatrice. I found that bit at the end so just profoundly inspiring. Thank you. It's a great way to walk through life, having that kind of fearless attitude, and it's inspiring. Wanted to once again plug that applications are open for the Humanity in Action Summer Fellowship Program. Just click on the link on globaldispatchespodcast.com. It'll take you to the application. If you have any questions about the Humanity in Action program, please do feel free to reach out to me. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.
The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of Humanity in Action.